Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Watershed. My name is Mark Cosgrove. I'm the cinema curator here at Watershed and delighted to welcome you to this conversation about cinema, which is a strand that we have been running here at Watershed for the past few months. It started out as a partnership with Bristol University. Very simply, we would give Bristol University contact up there, the films that were coming up, and they would flash it around the university, and we'd get some interesting academics talking about the films that were coming up. And it was good because it wasn't coming from a kind of film studies background, it was coming right across the spectrum of the university. So we got some interesting speakers and we got some interesting conversations, and the idea is that we have an introduction from somebody who's interested or connected in the subject matter for 10 minutes, and then after the film we'll go into the cafe bar and have a quite informal conversation. The idea of conversations about cinema has grown. We've now developed a website, and we're working nationally with a lot of partners, particularly Chapter Cinema in Wales and the Queen's Film Theatre in Belfast, to develop a programme of work around the impact of conflict. So it's conversations about cinema. If you go online to that site, you'll see the strand impact of conflict, which has connected a number of films that we've screened and that we're about to screen. And Maidan, the documentary from the Ukraine, is one of those that fits into the impact of conflict. And very delighted to have somebody from Bristol University who's a philosophy student, Sam Watts, who we discovered through the history department at Bristol University, was a student who'd gone to Ukraine when the revolution was starting, to find out for himself what was going on. A very brave thing to do, I think, in the context. But very delighted that Sam's going to come. He watched the film earlier this week, and he's going to say a few words, 10 minutes, by way of introduction. And then at the end, as I say, if we go into the cafe bar, we can have an informal discussion with Sam about his experience and about the film. But I'm delighted to welcome Sam Watts.
Right, well, good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much to Mark and Watershed for inviting me to do this talk. It's not every day that a student gets to do something like this, so thank you very much. And thank you all for coming to watch this film. The stuff in Ukraine is very, very important, and I know that it would mean a lot to the people who are out there, actually. So, firstly, I'm going to discuss my experiences in Ukraine, and then attempt to relate that back to the subject matter of the film and the events that you're about to see. So in 2014, I visited a place called Dnipropetrovsk. It's about 300 miles southeast of Kiev, and it's sort of on the edge of the ATO operation zone, so basically where the current conflict is occurring. There are three reasons for this. Firstly, it's the edge of what is called Novorussia by Putin, or New Russia. There's a lot of ethnic Russians there, along with ethnic Ukrainians, and Russian is spoken as commonly as Ukrainian, if not slightly more. Secondly, since the conflict has begun, there's been over 1 million refugees or internally displaced people who have moved from the conflict zone. Of those, 72,000 are present in Dnipropetrovsk. Thirdly, there is several large universities in the city, and I'd hope to speak to students and young adults, both fleeing from the conflict and dealing with the conflict, to try and find out how their lives have been affected post-Maidan and by the conflict itself. I'd hoped to tell these stories back to the people at Bristol University and more widely, although that's actually quite difficult, to try and communicate what was going on behind the scenes that you'd see on the news. So there are real people out there, real stories that people often don't hear, and I think it's very important that that comes across. I think that this human focus is something that Maidan deals with quite well. It's something that we're encouraged to consider in this film. He presents us with scenes from the revolution that allow us to bear witness to the faces that are otherwise anonymous in the crowds. For me, when I first saw this film, I found myself focusing on the individuals who would otherwise be eclipsed. And I think that there's an important sense in which this film is as much about the participants in the revolution than the events itself. It's important to recognise that the Maidan revolution did not just take place in Kiev, although this film is only filmed in Kiev. Events took place all around the country, ranging from small protests in places like Donetsk to larger ones in larger cities that escalated into full-scale rioting and were suppressed in similar ways. As was explained to me, these Maidan protests have in a lot of ways been a standard against which many Ukrainians, particularly those too young to have taken part in the 2005 Orange Revolution, have gone on to define themselves. And as such, it's very important that we try and consider the motivations behind them. To illustrate this, it's worth noting in the film that you're about to watch the strong sense of solidarity that is amongst the protesters. Even amongst steadily escalating violence, you still see people being organised and united against the Yanukovych government and also against the special police force, or Berkut, who you'll see towards the end of the film. Even for those who can't directly resist the violence, you still see people who are otherwise more infirm breaking rocks and building barricades so that they can defend themselves and continue to resist the government. I think that this is continued post-Maidan, and with many people who I've spoken to, they would tell me about how they continue to volunteer in the spirit of the revolution. In one way or the other, this help would contribute to the current post-Maidan identity of Ukraine, and they take many forms. So, for example, you'd have people giving supplies and crowdfunding equipment and necessary medical care for the soldiers on the front line, or doing something as simple as visiting troops in the hospital who'd been wounded, reading to them, playing chess or cards with them, and just generally keeping them company. Following Maidan, it would seem that there is a real unification and the creation of a strong community for Ukraine. It's not necessarily a Ukrainian community, but a post-Maidan identity that covers all sorts of other ethnicities. So, importantly, this will include Russians and other Eastern Europeans, and it's very inclusive. Crucially, they were only formed in opposition to the Yanukovych government. This has had its genesis in the hope of removing that government, and in the same ways that people would volunteer to do something as profound as fight on the barricades, or something as menial as provide food and distribute it to those who are, protesting, people continue to help any way they possibly can. Understood in this way, then, the film is a reflection of a staunchly united Ukrainian people, exploring the community of the initial revolution and indirectly inviting us to consider the community that was created at that time. However, although we are given privileged access to the protesters, our perspective is unabashedly limited to their camps, kitchens and barricades. In an important sense, we are reduced to spectators on the action, which is mostly left to speak for itself. Little effort is made to understand the causes and motivations or challenge their views, and we are provided with only enough context to situate what we see within the wider series of events. Any further information must be taken from translated protest songs, speeches, and conversations that we might catch fragments of when the camera pans across. The result, I think, is a film that is profoundly provocative. Viewing the protests as it does, there is a sense of participation in the events that occur, and it invites us to associate with the protesters and the community that they represent. However, the extent to which we can do this is a little bit less clear. To try and fully understand their motivations and goals, we don't have enough information, and we're encouraged to consider it ourselves. The static camera seems to emphasise our role as spectators, and the lack of context has little to help us identify with the problems or the protesters or grasp the significance of the situation. Taken in isolation, then, I think that this film is dangerously narrow-focused. However, we are given privileged access to the protesters and the protest, yet very little idea of what it is all about. Given the current conflict, I'm sure you'd all agree that this is incredibly important. Therefore, I think that Maidan is an important introduction to what went on, in that the director is asking us to consider for ourselves what happened. The onus on us after watching it is as much on reflecting on what we've seen, but also trying to question it and see how this documentary has given us objective access to something that is a very important part of history. I will be in the bar afterwards. I've got plenty of stories if you want to hear them. I hope you enjoy the film, and I encourage you to come and grill me. Thank you very much.